I'm going to talk about what I call decision useful climate scenarios, which has the useful acronym of DUCS, DUCS. So you'll see that acronym appear in this presentation periodically. Of course, this is a field full of four-letter acronyms, so apologies for that. Hopefully you'll be familiar with at least a few of those four-letter acronyms. What I am trying to evangelize for is a shift away from what are now the sort of industry standard in terms of climate scenarios, which are the sort of official scenarios which have been used particularly by policymakers and regulators around the world, which are really completely underestimating the risks and opportunities that we face in the midst of climate change. So I'm going to dive straight in. The sort of key points that I'm going to be talking about are the fact that the official scenarios that come from the likes of the central banks are based on very smooth global warming pathways. And in these scenarios, everything happens in a very linear kind of fashion. And this completely understates the kind of risks and opportunities that we're confronted with, not just in the long term, but also in the short term. And that's really important because, of course, companies are now faced with the task of reporting on their risks and opportunities and producing transition plans, which by definition means that you need to look at shorter horizons. So you're not just looking at 2050, you have to have a game plan around what you're going to be doing over the next few years. So we need scenarios which are much more realistic to be useful. So we need shorter term narratives which pick up on aspects of the real world which are completely missing from the official scenarios. And this is another four-letter acronym which some of you will have heard about before, which is VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. VUCA is missing from the official scenarios. It has to be layered on afterwards, if at all. And the other critical thing, and I know that many of you are in the finance function, is bizarrely, these scenarios do not have finance embedded in them. These are real economy projections that result from looking at climate models and applying them to models which produce real economy variables like GDP. There's no finance involved at all. But there's also a big elephant in the room here, which is that finance around the world is charged with the task of dealing with financial materiality or single materiality. This is the impact of the environment on your company. But of course, we're increasingly moving to a situation where we've got to look at double materiality. In other words, we need to add in the impact that your company is having on the planet. And these two things are actually quite different. There's a lot of talk about win-win situations, which is great if you can find them. But very often these two things do run into conflict with one another. And more tangibly, what do you do if the world is not on track towards net zero? You know, we saw from the survey that a vast majority of you have got net zero targets, and over half of you have got targets which are interim targets. And yet 88% of you have said that we're not on track to halve emissions by the end of the decade. And I think you can see the problem, because if you are committed to an interim target which is predicated on emissions, for example, halving by the end of the decade, you have a problem. So we'll come back to that later on. Okay, so getting your ducks in a row. Here I'm just, in a very conceptual way, sort of critiquing what I call Planet NGFS. What is Planet NGFS? Well, NGFS is the acronym for the Network for Greening the Financial System. This is the body that most of the central banks and regulators in the financial sector are a member of. They have been producing A lot of the scenarios have been used for things like stress tests. But the problem is these scenarios are completely stress-free because they don't actually have any volatility or uncertainty or complexity. They are equilibrium model-based, and yet we're quite clearly in a state of disequilibrium. The world is not moving in a linear fashion. We're not moving on smooth trends. There's a lot of shocking things happening. And so we need to be not just in optimizing mode, we need to be thinking about resilience, and we need to be thinking about credible narratives rather than looking for spuriously precise numbers. Now, some of you, I would imagine, have studied statistics and the normal distribution. The graphic on the right-hand side here shows the classic bell-shaped curve in black, where things happen in a relatively predictable way. You've got no unusual surprises from the probability distribution. But actually, this is not like the real world. In the case of climate, the probability distribution is skewed. It's skewed to the negative side, and it's so-called fat tail. So extreme events are far more common than the normal distribution would imply. And unfortunately, this probability distribution is not stationary. It's moving to the left. It's moving in a more negative direction. So this runs a coach and horses through a lot of traditional risk management techniques. And it does call for a different way of thinking about the future. And this leads me to one of my cliches, which is narratives eat modeling for breakfast when it comes to scenarios. What do I mean about that? It's let's not dive straight into a model. You have to get the story straight in the first place. What are the questions are you trying to answer? Because that is what dictates what kind of a model you need, what kind of data you need. And sometimes the important things are not possible to model. So a classic example of this would be some of the political risks that we face, not the least of which this year is in the US elections. Clearly, the outcome of the US election is going to be extremely consequential, but this is nowhere to be seen on planet NGFS. So as I say, there's no amount of modeling is going to save you if you're not asking the right questions. So this graphic gives you a sort of a conceptual picture of the dimensions of scenarios. If you think about it, the long-term official scenarios are very much long-term. They're looking out to 2050. They are systemic. We're looking at the global level, and they are looking at impact. In other words, they're looking at global warming pathways and, by implication, the emissions pathways. They're not looking at the financial implications. So they have a different scale and scope to what business needs, because business, obviously, in general, has a distinctive geographic pattern. Sometimes they're very localized. And of course, you are concerned with financial materiality, not just impact. The other thing is that from a practical point of view, business clearly makes a lot of decisions which are short term. Yes, we have to be conscious of the long-term risks, and indeed, a majority of you have net zero targets. So you've got the memo about the long-term existential risk, but now you have to do something about it. You have to have a transition plan, and therefore you have to look at the short term. And this is another way of looking at this. This box shows you the different ways of slicing scenarios by scale on the vertical axis and scope on the horizontal. So if you like, the NGFS or the official scenarios are in this sort of top right-hand box of systemic impact or inside-out risk, systemic impact scenarios, whereas actually the great need is now for outside in other words, the single materiality perspective for your business, not the system as a whole. So I think that is something which has been lost in the discussions about climate scenarios. And moving back to the time dimension, the other of the three dimensions that I mentioned earlier, these graphics, again, very stylized diagrams to illustrate the point, show, I think, another very important distinction. Now, the official scenarios, which are based on the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC's climate science work, have this typical picture, which is global average temperatures. I stress average. We're not talking about the tails here, it's means. This is the temperature above the pre-industrial average. You know, the famous 1.5 degrees is what we're trying to aim for under the Paris Agreement. And you get this sort of fan-shaped picture of different climate scenarios. Well, the interesting thing about a lot of these charts is there isn't a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in 2030. Climate scientists say, give or take, we're probably going to be around 1.5, maybe slightly more. We had a bit of a blip in the last year because of the El Nino effect, but there's not a huge amount of uncertainty about global warming. It's literally baked in. And by the way, we've all got the memo, we've all signed up to net zero. So therefore, what we really should be looking at is what I call the fan, which is the multiple different ways we have to net zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what this graphic is. And again, it's a very schematic thing, but everybody's starting from a different place, but we're all, broadly speaking, trying to aim for net zero. And then on the right-hand side is what I have called the onion, which is that if you're an individual organization, of course, you have your own aggregate emissions position, but you've got many choices about how to get to net zero. You have choices over the timing. And by the way, there's no mandatory obligation to follow a particular path, even if you have accepted the idea that you're aiming for net zero. Now, so there are many things that need to be considered when you're producing a decision useful scenario, and you need to bring in the elements of volatility that are crucial to what's happening in the real world. And this is a very crowded slide because it shows you how many risks are basically overlooked by the official scenarios. They have to be layered in afterwards, if at all. So on the physical side, bizarrely, typically they don't include the weather, right? They're looking at global average temperatures over the long term. They're not looking at, heat waves and floods and so on. They're not even looking at things like sea level rise. All of these things need to be brought in. My colleagues at Exeter do an excellent job in analysing this and talking about so-called tipping points where things happen suddenly, like the collapse of the polar ice sheets, for example. And there are all sorts of feedback loops which are missing from the analysis. There's no pandemics and there's no natural capital losses in this world. And the transition risk, this is the sort of non-physical risk that arise from the transition to net zero. Typically, this is modeled purely by carbon pricing. Now, some progress has been made on carbon pricing, but it's pretty obvious that there are many other things that are happening on the policy front, but there's also other things that are affecting the value of carbon-related financial assets. So you can have little matters like wars, Ukraine in the Middle East, or we have volatility in the financial markets, which can affect the value of your high carbon assets. The economy does run with spare resources, and therefore net zero isn't a cost, it's potentially a benefit, because in investing you can draw in unemployed resources. It doesn't necessarily drive up interest rates in a way that it does in a lot of official scenarios. So many things need to be brought into the picture. This next slide shows you the classic scenario drivers that you have to consider. At the center of it all, of course, is global warming and physical risk in general. But what really matters is the human agency, the human action that's surrounding this. What are we doing about it? Is it to do with policy, to do with the state of the economy, what's happening to technology, and what's happening to social pressures? But there's also another crucial thing, which is finance is embedded in this complex world. Finance is actually driving a lot of these things. Where you put your money, where you invest, where you lend, does affect the pace of growth and the rollout of technology, and it also responds to policy and social pressures as well. So you need to look at the different financial implications. And if we see volatility in the financial markets, that will affect the transition. So, excuse me. So, the other thing which is remarkable about Planet NGFS is that it starts from one view of economic activity, so-called socioeconomic pathway 2 of the IPCC, which is 2.8% growth forever, every single year. That's the point of departure. Whereas in reality, we know that economic activity is volatile. Just think about what's happened over the last 5 years with the pandemic and the Ukraine war. And so in the scenarios that we produced last year for USS in the UK and the No Time to Lose report, we embedded quite different pathways for economic activity. And that's obviously extremely consequential for emissions and for financial asset prices. So just quickly, these are the 4 scenarios that we put together in a classic 2x2 matrix. The 2 driving forces of the scenarios are on the vertical scale, politics and policy. So as you go up the matrix, this is where policy action is rapid and taking us quickly towards net zero. And at the bottom half, it's going slowly. And then on the horizontal dimension, you have what the private sector is doing, what I call market dynamism. This basically conflates what's happening to economic activity, the availability of finance, the speed at which technology is being rolled out, and also the kind of social pressures that are going on in society towards net zero. So again, high-low on that dimension as well. We want to be in the top right-hand box. That's what we're aiming for with net zero. We call it sort of roaring 20s. This is where policy and markets align. But what was striking in the conversations that we had with our colleagues at USS was that as time went on, they increasingly were disheartened about the prospects of actually being in that quadrant, and that the other 3 were perhaps more likely. And that's certainly set them thinking about their own interim targets. So the worst place, of course, is in the bottom left, where there's geopolitical friction. China and the US are loggerheads over renewable technology, for example. The markets are in a mess. Economic activity is struggling. Technology is moving slowly. That's a very unpleasant quadrant. And then you've got 2 intermediate ones. One called Green Phoenix, which is basically led by the market, geopolitics remaining dysfunctional. And then at the top left-hand side, boom and bust, where the markets are volatile, technology is moving at a disappointing pace, and basically the public sector has to drive net zero forward. So I just wanted to spend a few moments talking about the distinction between double and single materiality again. As I mentioned, at the moment, companies are obliged to focus on financially material risks and opportunities. They have fiduciary duties enshrined in law that they have to meet. And incidentally, TCFD and the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, are starting from a single materiality perspective. In other words, the impact of climate change on your finances. It's not looking at your impact on the climate, which is the other half of double materiality, if you like, impact materiality. And if you think about it, the net zero target is inherently an impact target. Okay, so for the time being, that remains voluntary. Of course, we are seeing requirements increasingly to report on a double materiality basis, as we see with the CSRD in the EU. But for the time being, the focus has to be on financial materiality in terms of your obligations. So bespoke scenarios, therefore, also need to consider your performance relative to your peers, because even if you have a commitment to reduce your emissions, this actually includes the impact of other actors in your value chain, whether it's your customers or your suppliers. And yes, you can try and engage with them. Yes, you can try and influence them, but you're not in control. And therefore, whether or not you're going to hit your uh, targets is very much contingent on the behavior of others. So this is the purpose of this graphic on the right-hand side, where I essentially distinguish between success and failure at the systemic level. So the systemic level is on the vertical dimension. So the green background at the top there shows you where the system is going towards net zero. It's greening successfully. And the bottom half is where the system is failing to hit net zero. So that's why it's staying red. And on the left-hand column, this is where you as an individual organization are failing to get to net zero, hence the red button in the middle. And on the right-hand side, this is where you are succeeding in getting to net zero. So again, we want to be in the top right-hand corner, going green in a greening world, as I put it. The interesting aspect of this is you actually don't have to do a great deal to persuade others to do the right thing because they're doing it anyway. And this is what I call the free ride, or you could call it green sponging. The worst situation, of course, is the bottom left, where you're staying red, but you're in a red world. So this is like a collective failure scenario. Now, of course, a lot of people are very concerned about being left behind, so staying red in a green world. This is where you could be left behind holding fossil fuel assets which get stranded. That could be very dangerous for your company. And that, I think, has preoccupied a lot of the NGOs, trying to get people moving. And it's good that most of you are already on course towards net zero. That's great. But there's also another danger on the opposite side, which is what I call premature virtue, which is going too fast. If you go too fast and in a world that isn't moving as quickly enough to get to net zero, you can suffer from premature virtue. We've seen some companies having to backtrack on their commitments and losing money on green investments. So you need to be careful as an individual organization about just how quickly you progress. So I'm sorry, let's go on to the next one, which is how do you proceed? What's your strategy to get towards your emissions targets, particularly the so-called scope 3 emissions and the rest of your value chain? One strategy is basically to divest and to offload brown or red activities, if you will, and to switch very quickly towards a green balance sheet and a green business. That could lead to a very rapid move towards net zero targets, but it doesn't really help the system if you're offloading these dirty assets to actors who are perhaps less interested in heading towards net zero. So that's, if you like, the relatively quick fix. The hard work in the top right-hand side here is engagement, which is trying to persuade others in your value chain, or if you're a financial organization, you have investee companies. That's tough going. You've got to really put some effort into doing that. So engagement is hard work, but it ultimately has high impact on the system. And then in the middle, you've got the free ride again, which is where you basically just make sure you associate with people in your value chain who are on course towards the transition. You don't have to spend too much time persuading them because they have got credible transition plans in place already. So that, I think, is something for you to think about in terms of how you pitch your strategy. Just a quick point here on tipping points, which is a great theme of my colleagues at Exeter, which is on the left-hand side. We talked a little bit earlier about the physical tipping points of the climate, which is obviously associated also with extreme weather events, which are, of course, sadly increasing rapidly at the moment. But there are also non-physical negative tipping points like wars and climate policy reversals, financial crashes, which could cause difficulties. But I do want to point out that there are also potentially positive tipping points in terms of sudden shifts in policy. I think the IRA Act in the US has had, I think, very beneficial effects on progress. And we could see some continuing improvements on the technology front that could really accelerate the move towards net zero. So there are a number of positive things as well to be included. So when you think about the taxonomy of decision making, which I've superimposed on this slide, these tipping points are extremely consequential when you're thinking about your strategy and setting your net zero targets and your transition plans. And that's where scenarios can be extremely useful in helping you to get a sense of what the range of possibilities are in the future. So just to quickly summarize, the official scenarios on climate change are predicated on smooth global warming trajectories, which significantly understate the risks and opportunities that we face. What we need to be doing is shifting towards a paradigm of bespoke transition plans, which embody shorter term narratives, which embrace the kind of volatility that I've mentioned here, and also financial materiality. Global warming is essentially baked in over the next 5 to 10 years, so we need to be looking much more at extreme weather and, if you like, acute physical risks. And we also have some dangerously close tipping points over the next 10 to 15 years. And we mustn't forget that politics and economics are extremely volatile periodically, and this is often glossed over in official scenarios. The big elephant in the room is double materiality. You have to think carefully about what others are doing in this world as well. So I was asked to get the conversation going with a few suggestions about what the next steps might be. So this, sorry, it's a bit of a wordy slide, but I'll just quickly run through the main headlines, which is that it's crucial, if you've not already, to identify the financially material risks opportunities that you're facing. And I think you need to think carefully about what your use cases are for your scenarios. Are you principally interested in risk management, for example, or are you principally interested in transition planning? Those perhaps need quite different ways of thinking. I would advocate that you appoint somebody in your organization to lead the way on climate scenarios, to coordinate a team of people, even if it's a virtual team, and it's a cross-functional thing. You need to bring in people from finance, from risk, from your sustainability department if you have one, and your economic research team if you have one. And I think initiating the creation of some narrative sets that are relevant to your business, relevant in terms of scale and scope and time horizons, I think is extremely important. It's a worthwhile investment. So to ensure that you're asking the right questions. Obviously, if you're working for a large organization, you have the potential over time to build an internal infrastructure to start quantifying those narratives. It's not an easy task, but I think it's something that should pay a lot of dividends, literally and metaphorically. Small companies perhaps have to stick to more simplified approaches and lean heavily on the support of consultants, and maybe talk to the larger partners that you have in your value chain or your industry associations. Non-financial corporations clearly, often need to have more tailored scenarios, maybe more sector specific and more localized, and perhaps more granular analysis, including looking at your real asset profile, because they may well be subject to some unusual physical risks, which need to be considered carefully. I would also advocate that you lobby your local policymakers, regulators, and industry associations to produce more relevant scenario sets than what's being currently produced. And I think it would also be a good thing if you could lobby for them to make double materiality mandatory, because that would definitely level the playing field. So I'm sorry, I've perhaps run over time there a bit, Theme, but I hope that you found that useful.